Good evening. You're all very welcome to our final day of the Bealtaine Festival, where we're celebrating our living earth. Thank you for joining us. If you've been here all week, thank you for your company. If you're new, thank you for joining us. We're talking about some very important issues. All week in the festival, we've been looking at different aspects of biodiversity and natural heritage, and today we're going to start looking at what do we need to do. Now, the International Day for Biodiversity was yesterday, and the and the theme this year is all about looking to see what can we do for nature, and that's going to be the theme we're going to address. Now, I'm just going to look back a little bit, and I'm not just on this festival. I'm going to take a look back a little further. This is the 17th year of the festival, and it was. We are delighted that we have been part of the UN's International Day for Biodiversity over the years since they began. And 2011 to 2020 was the decade on biodiversity. And we were a partner through that, and we were delighted to be able to represent Ireland or show activity from Ireland in the global community. We are registered as a, a country this year, as in normal years, that we have Ireland on the map on the International Biodiversity Day map, and it's the Bealtaine Festival that is flying the Irish flag. So we're very proud of that. I should just maybe roll back a little, and at the start of that decade for biodiversity, we had events running in Ireland, and we were delighted to be the. Let me just turn myself off there. We were delighted to be listed in that year as one of the top 10 events on the Guardian environmental blog, and there we are. Here we are. You might see us a little closer in that. It's an old scan. So we were we did make the list as one of the top in the world, and we're delighted. We're up against people like the American Museum of Natural History were on that, and I'd just like to show that we were number 9, and just to our guest today, number 10 was Kew Gardens. So might be mentioning. I'll mention the relevance of that again in a few minutes. So we've been. This festival has very proudly been flying the flag in Ireland, and I suppose also it was a busy week this week. So we were delighted to win the Education Awards Best Outreach Award during the week. So it's been a very busy week for us. I just thought I'd have to show that again while it's current and new. So you'll forgive me. So I'd like to invite Kaylee on now. Kaylee is the coordinator of the festival this year, and so I want her to come on and just maybe recap on the festival and tell us what her favorite things were. And bear in mind that there's been a whole festival for young people going on during the week, as well as our evening sessions.
Yeah,
Kaylee,
so as Owen
what
said,
was the best?
as Owen said, we've had absolutely packed, I suppose, last 7 or 8 days. The festival started last Saturday, and it has just grown and grown and grown over the last number of days. The core ethos of the festival is designed to encourage people of all ages to explore nature and beauty all around us, and that's really what we've done over the last week or so. We had 5,000 young people from all around the southeast engaged with land and sea through the Atlantic Aquarium Wild About Wildlife series. We had a tour from the seal rescue. We also had Dave's Jungle. We got up close and personal with some creepy crawlies, and we learned some really interesting facts as well from the National Reptile Zoo in Kilkenny. Alongside our schools program, we also had a schools competition, a drawing competition, which I think you'll see some entries for as well coming up. They're absolutely fantastic to see children right up from junior infants all the way up to TY kind of expressing what they have learned about biodiversity and just little things here and there that will stick with them now as over the summer to come as they kind of prepare to spend a summer outdoors. In addition as well, I know we've had quite a number of you here each day for our Bealtaine Living Earth TV broadcasts. It has been absolutely jam-packed. We started off the week with Lafcadio O'Hearn Gardens in Tramore in conjunction with the Tramore Eco Group. We had a wellness session about exploring wellness in nature from Dr. Mark Rowe. We had tours from the JFK Arboretum. We had as well, of course, I have to mention our Dr. Sheila Donegan's interview on RTE at the Today Show, which was absolutely fantastic and well done, Sheila. We were delighted to have you flying the flag for Calmast. We also went on a bit of a nature walk with Eric Dempsey, learning all about summer and migratory birds. We heard from Kieran Craven of the Copper Coast, telling us all about geological erosion and what to expect. We heard from Dr. Una Fitzpatrick. We were delighted to have her on board on World Bee Day, one of the busiest days for Una, I suppose, in the year. And as we all know, Una was the founder of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. We also yesterday had Yvonne Grace from WIT telling us all about No Mow May and what we can do to bring biodiversity back into our own community. And today, of course, we're going to be asking ourselves what we can do for our climate and for our natural world as well. So we've had an absolutely jam-packed, I suppose, week as well. From our live shows and our sessions, we also have a huge range of activities and resources on our website as well. So if anyone leaves this session here today and you're like, what else can I do to explore biodiversity and nature around us? All you have to do is pop over to our Bealtaine Living Earth website. There's activities and resources, and of course, they're fun for all ages as well. And just in case you have seen something absolutely fantastic, which I'm sure you have over the last week, all of our Bealtaine Living Earth TV broadcasts will be available on our website as well. So don't worry if your friends and family missed it. They'll be up there for everyone to explore and enjoy over the coming months as well. So I think that's hopefully a nice, concise recap of the week. And I'd like to hand you back over to Owen.
Great. Thanks very much, Kaylee. And thanks for the great work you did coordinating the festival. And that thanks goes also to Ben, Enrica and Una, and of course Sheila, and all the people who supported us in the lead up to this festival and have supported us over the years. Speaking of support, we have a message from Grace O'Sullivan, MEP, who is in Brussels and has we caught up with her. And she has been a great supporter of the festival going back years before she ever became elected as an MEP. So we're grateful to her, and we'll hear from her now.
Hi everyone from a very windy, wet and grey Brussels. I'm delighted to hear that despite COVID, the Bealtaine Living Earth Festival has been a great success this year. And it's so important in terms of promoting biodiversity and environmental care, and also showcasing the beauty of the southeast of Ireland. The southeast has so many places of exceptional scenery and natural heritage, and it's really important that we protect it and that we hand it down to future generations in a decent way. The Bealtaine Living Earth Festival is a great way to learn about biodiversity and what we have on our doorstep and why it's so important to protect it. I think we can all agree one of the facts of COVID was that there has been increased connection and awareness of nature and biodiversity. And education is so important in the whole area of biodiversity and environmental protection. And I'm also delighted to hear that more than 5,000 children have taken part in the festival. I look forward to joining you all next year, hopefully face to face and person to person at the festival. And well done. Wish you all the very best. From Brussels, over and out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. And indeed, we all hope to be together in person next year. Now, before we move on to our guests, I want to share with you something that's been happening in Waterford Institute of Technology and on our grounds. And keeping with today's theme is about action. We know climate change is happening. We know the effects of it are going to be detrimental for many people around the world and for our biodiversity. And we need to focus on what can we do, and that's what we're focusing on today. And in fact, we have discovered a machine that can convert carbon dioxide into oxygen, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, which is fantastic. Of course, that machine is called a tree, and they've been around for millions of years, and we know all about them, and we need to get planting them. And our colleague, Tom Kent, of the forestry group in Waterford Institute of Technology, along with his students and with Corlin and Og Waterford, have been busy planting trees, and we can just see this quick video now to show the what they've been at. So that's a nice little project that has been completed. 1,500 trees been planted by young people, which is wonderful. And the plan is to go on and to create corridors of trees, and all with Irish native trees species, which of course are the ones most suited to our environment and to supporting our own native biodiversity. So hopefully next year, this time next year, we'll actually be out on our Carriganore campus, where we have the new plantations, but also we have some mature woodland there as well. So Tom has promised to bring us out, and there will be a lot more trees planted by then. I'm joined now by Professor Liam Dolan and Kevin O'Sullivan. Kevin is a former editor of the Irish Times and is currently the Environment and Science editor of the Irish Times. People might be very, very familiar with his work, and we have to say that the Irish Times has been really to the forefront of science communication in Ireland, and for quite a considerable amount of time. They have a science page every Thursday, and but also the quality of the journalism in explaining and trying to communicate science to the public is so important, and it has been so important in the last year during COVID, when people are fearful and confused, and people like Kevin in the Irish Times were able to present the information in a way that was understandable and in a way that was balanced. And it was a very difficult job, because this was a very interesting time in terms of science communication and in science, because normally science is done behind closed doors in labs, and it's you find out years later the fruits of that science. Whereas in the last 15 months, it has been happening in front of our eyes, and we've been following it day by day. And in that, there has been a lot of confusion, because that's how science works. People have different ideas and they chase them up. And what happens is it's the evidence. The evidence starts building and building for one particular case. So it was a very difficult, challenging time, and we must say that we're very grateful to Kevin and other journalists who did that job. So thank you, Kevin. Kevin has been been involved in the Robert Boyle Winter School last year, and little did we know that it would be our last live event when we were talking about climate change. And so hopefully we'll be back to live soon. I'm also joined by Liam Dolan. Liam was with us last year when he was the professor of botany in Oxford University. He has moved on, and he's senior scientist at the Gregor Mendel Institute in Vienna now. Liam is a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, and among his many other hats, he's also the Queen's trustee at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. Hence my point that, you know, Kew is very good. They're nearly as good as us. So you're both very welcome. I might just start with you, Kevin. There has been a lot happening, even though people have been focused on COVID. I think there is a lot of awareness that once COVID is over, we need to address climate change. Climate change is it's here, it's now. The time for pushing it down the road or arguing with climate change deniers is over. We must get into action. During the week, there was a meeting in Dublin on climate change. What were they talking about?
Thank you very much, Owen, and thank you very much for your kind comments. And just firstly to congratulate everyone in terms of the festival, because it's really a very tangible thing that links to nature and that underlines the value of nature and biodiversity, which is fantastic. And we need a lot more of that. And obviously, you know, that is tied into the climate issue as well. But last week there was a gathering in Dublin, and it was to try and inject greater urgency in terms of climate ambition. And it's very clear, if you look at the science now, that even with all the great promises that countries are making, that if you just look at their current action and delivery to date, that we are facing a world that would be 3.7 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times by the end of the century. And as you all probably know, that's an inhabitable world really for many vast areas. You know, that it would mean desertification, it would mean inundation of coastal regions. So it's just not feasible for the vast majority of human life. So we need to get moving quickly. And the key mechanism to really scale up action is the COP, and they number it based on each year. So it's COP26 this year. It's hosted by the UK government, and it's in Glasgow. So, you know, if we want to get to a better place, we have to agree things there. So it's no use trotting up to Glasgow and then saying, hopefully we might get something. There's a whole series of initiatives to try and scale up that ambition in advance. And one of them was the Leaders Summit hosted by President Biden there recently, where a lot of the major global leaders and a lot of leaders from the big carbon emitting countries attended, and made, you know, very significant promises to scale up ambition. So the key thing is that there are two targets out there now that really we need to deliver on. One is that we have our emissions by 2030, and that's only a decade away. And then that the world reach carbon neutrality are also what's known as net zero emissions by 2050. And so if we don't move quickly, there's no possibility of having emissions. And if you look at the way emissions are rising since economies are opening up again, it's really worrying. So that means that, the clock is ticking even more. And then if we don't meet the 2030 targets, it makes net zero emissions by 2050 impossible to achieve. So we need to scale up that ambition now. And the Dublin Gathering, it was one of the Dublin Climate Dialogues. It was just investigating how that might be done. And at the end of the 2 days, they issued a declaration which mimics a lot of the agenda for COP26. So it was very astutely designed. And very, very significantly, the government endorsed it, and it was handed over to the UK government to feed into the COP26. And the other thing about it, the gathering, was that John Kerry spoke at the opening. And that was a really big endorsement of the whole process. And it made, even at the last minute, some very significant other scientists and countries, particularly from China, participated. So it means that we're getting people around the table, and we're moving to a better place.
Okay, and Liam, what are the impacts? I mean, when people became aware and scientists started talking about climate change, they were talking about very small increases. 3.7 degrees is an enormous increase in town, and of course that's not everywhere goes up 3.7. Some places will have really extreme temperatures. What's the impact on biodiversity, and what's the impact then of that loss of biodiversity?
So if I could just say that the impact is going to be negative. And the reason it's negative is that you have this change in the environment in which organisms, this is microorganisms, plants, animals, and aquatic organisms are living, and they don't have time to adapt. So many of the climate change deniers say that we're just living through a normal cycle of climate change, which has occurred since, continually over the last 4.6 billion years since the Earth was born. But what's different about this change is two things. One is the speed at which it is happening, and the second is that it's human-made. So there was a sudden climate change event back around 70 million years ago when a meteor hit the planet and the dinosaurs went extinct. So we know about that rapid event, but that wasn't a human generated event. What we're living through now is a human generated event. And what's happening is that climate around the world is changing very rapidly. And what would happen if this were a part of the normal cycle of post-ice age climate change that we've seen for the last 10, 15,000 years, is that the change would be much slower. And as it changes, then plants and animals would either locally adapt or they would migrate. And so over time, there would be this gradual change, and organisms would be replaced by other organisms as the local environment changed. What's happening now is happening so quickly that the organisms don't have a chance to adapt. Natural selection is not acting quickly enough on the genetic variation that exists in populations there. And as a result, we'll see dead zones. We'll see zones where organisms have gone extinct, but they haven't been replaced by better adapted organisms. And so there are some examples of this that can help you imagine this, because it is quite catastrophic. And there's one study that's been done in Australia. And what they found is that brown algae, so these are the kelps and the fucus-like brown algae that you find growing on rocky beaches, and we have them around Ireland. They've been migrating southwards as the climate's been changing. Well, what's going to happen is a time will come where they run out of a place to migrate to, because they get to the southern tip of Australia and there's no rocky shore between southern Australia and Antarctica. So these plants will go extinct. We're seeing similar events in the Alps, where plants which 20 years ago, 40 years ago, were more abundant at lower altitudes are now migrating up mountains. And of course, a time will come when the tops of those mountains will be too warm for them. So we are seeing what's happening, and we know the reason why is the plants and animals cannot adapt quickly enough. And we'll see changes in Ireland and in Britain. So in Britain, for example, beech, which is not native to Ireland, but it is a native to the UK or to Britain, is being pushed further north. So it's no longer growing very well in the very south part of Britain, and it's moving north. But it's not moving quickly enough, because we're going to see this change, as Kevin says, by the end of this century. That's not enough time for beech forests to migrate and for local adaptation to occur. And besides, there's nowhere for them to move, because there's only little packets of beech forests that are left because of the human engagement in the environment through agriculture and urban development. So what's happening, as I said at the beginning, is the rate of change is unprecedented here. And if you like, the organisms don't have a chance to catch up. And as a result, there are going to be dead zones left behind and extinctions. And part of the mass extinction that we're going through at the moment.
Okay, that's very serious, obviously. What about the Amazon, the rainforests around the tropical zones? How will they fare? Can they withstand these changes?
So it depends on the nature of the change. So what Kevin will be able to tell you a lot more about the consequences of climate change. But one of the things that's expected, and we're seeing evidence for, is more extreme weather events. So periodically, punctuated by El Nino, there are droughts across parts of the tropics. It's notable in Brazil, and it also can be felt in Central Africa. And what we're seeing now in the last few cycles of El Nino is that those drought cycles are much more intense than they were before. So it must be about 5 or 6 years ago, the last El Nino event, there was a huge mortality in large trees. So lots of large trees died in Amazonia, in the rainforest regions. There'll be other areas where we'll see different types of changes. So we heard about the fires in Australia last year. These fires were entirely predicted by the CSIRO, that's the Australian Government Research Council. They did work around 20 years ago, published a number of reviews, and predicted that by 2020, there would be extensive fires in parts of Southern Australia. And that's exactly what's happened. So we're going to see slightly different things happening in different parts of the world. So California and Australia will experience drier climates, and therefore the plant litter that's on the ground will be more combustible. And we've seen evidence of that both in Australia and in California. We're seeing extreme events in Amazonia, such as the drought that I mentioned. Now, in some of these places, there will be natural cyclical events that occur there, and that the system is robust enough to withstand them. However, speaking to people who work in Amazonia, the concern about the last El Nino event, which resulted in this drought and this huge mortality, was that they felt that the damage that was caused by that particular event was so great that it was going to take many years for the forest to recover. But if there's another El Nino event, coming up in a few years' time, then an already weakened ecosystem will be hit again. So the effects will be different in different parts of the world, but the key here is that there's likely to be change, and the organisms will struggle to adapt to that change, be that change more wet, more dry, cooler or warmer. They'll struggle with the change.
Okay, so biodiversity loss is inevitable on the path we're on. But in terms of the loss of, there's going to be a net loss of trees and vegetation. Then will that feed then into an accelerating global warming as well?
No, so this is very interesting. So one thing that one learns very quickly when you start reading about the climate system, sorry, about the Earth system, is the important roles of feedbacks. So if you change one thing, then it can feed back and make the situation either better or worse. So if, for example, climate change causes more damage to tropical forests, those tropical forests will be less able to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And therefore, because there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there will be more heat trapped in the atmosphere. If there's more heat trapped in the atmosphere, it'll make these El Nino severe weather events, climate events, much more severe, which will cause more damage. So that's an example of a feedback. And vegetation is very tightly linked into that interconnected network that controls the climate of the planet. And I think it's important to consider that if we're talking about biodiversity and we're talking about climate change, on the one hand, they're different, but they're all part of the whole. And that whole is the Earth system. So the Earth system comprises, the rocky heart of the planet, the crust of the planet, which comprises both dead, rocky material, inorganic material, but also living material and material derived from living organisms. So that's the soil. So soil has inorganic bits, organic bits, this is like carbon containing bits, and it's got living bits. And then on that soil, you've got you, me, all the plants around us, and then you've got the atmosphere. So you've got the atmosphere, the crust, and the earth. Together, we constitute the earth. And you cannot interact, or you cannot disturb one of those without causing an upset in one of the others. And the feedbacks that you mentioned there are an intricate part of the mechanism whereby these are interconnected. So if you affect one part of the system, you're likely to upset another part of the system.
And it's a very complex system. It's like a giant game of Jenga. You remove species here and there and habitats here and there, and you don't know what else is going to crumble. I think we maybe in the 1970s and into the 1980s, people who were involved or concerned with nature, they were concerned with the panda and the tiger. They were concerned with individual species, and that seemed to be how the people's awareness of the natural world seemed to work at the time. And now it's not about individual species; it's about the collective, isn't it? It's about every species. It's not just about saving the tiger and the panda and the whale. It's everything, and even things we don't maybe like so much, like our wasps, and everything is important. And that has been a huge change in people's awareness. I mean, everyone has that awareness now, I think. Kevin,
come in there. It's
yes,
that's the one really positive thing, that awareness of both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis has increased hugely, and even in the last 18 months. But the really worrying thing is that if we don't act within that decade that we were talking about, that irreversible impacts kick in, in the following decades, which is next to no time away. So it's really, we're up against it here. And then the other thing to underline is that we have a fantastic mechanism called the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they bring out the most definitive reports on global warming and emissions, and through various different groups and on a regular basis. And the 2018 report, was really very worrying in what it found. But to go back to what Liam was saying there, like they didn't factor in the full or possible impacts of feedbacks, and where ecosystems get out of control in terms of rebuilding or sustaining themselves. And again, that's a really, not to make it too totally dominated by gloom, but that's another reason why we must act very quickly.
I think at the start, I did show the logo for the decade on climate and biodiversity that we just finished, and I meant to make the point, I had it there in order to make the point that 10 years goes by in the blink of an eye. It isn't a lot of time when, I mean, we're running this festival for 17 years now, and so not a lot of action has taken place over the 17 years. So, I mean, it really is a case, there's no more time for prevarication. There's no more time for looking at, what about them over there? We really need to act quickly.
And the other thing,
in terms of Ireland.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of Ireland, Ireland is not going to escape. Ireland has particular consequences for Ireland in terms of storm surges. Like there are scientists who believe we're overdue a 3-meter storm surge, which, when you combine that with high tides, could cause devastation to coastal cities like Cork and Galway in particular. But Limerick is vulnerable. Dublin is very vulnerable as well. We are going to have a strange situation where we'll have more droughts, water shortages, even though we have this belief that we're a country with loads and loads of water, anytime we need it. And yet we're going to have more extreme flooding in wintertime, where you'll see vast tracts of land, saturated for weeks on end, and it will impair the ability to have normal food production. So there's a whole series of threats to Ireland. Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist, was speaking at the Dublin Climate Dialogue. She was talking about hurricane patterns. It's quite chilling, that they're more intensive, they're bigger, and they're going more northerly, and that means that the likelihood of them coming to Ireland is increased. So anything along the western seaboard, the south coast in particular, is especially vulnerable in that scenario, and we've had not insignificant warnings about that. So we do have to sit up ourselves and be aware of the direct consequences for us, but also I think we have to contribute to the global response to a warming world where developing countries are so vulnerable, and we are a wealthy country, so we have to do more than our fair share, in a sense, by helping collectively in the global response. And I think it's good to be able to say that in the last 2 years, we've upped our game very significantly on that. And it's going to be tested really significantly in the next few months, because, we'd have to sort of sign along a dotted line to say, this is what we're going to do in terms of carbon budgets, in terms of new climate plans, in terms of changing the way we do agriculture and in particular land use. So there's a lot of hard choices to be made, and they're not 10 years away, they're in the next year.
And Owen, if I could
yes.
Oh, sorry, just to continue on Kevin's line. When I worked in Oxford, a number of my colleagues did work in Africa, and they were looking at farmers changing farming habits amongst farmers in parts of West Africa. And already farmers have been changing the crops they're growing because of climate change. And they say that the plants that we used to grow now are now being grown by farmers who work on land that's 500 meters higher than where we are. So that impact is already anecdotally there. And I see that Mary O'Riordan has put in a question in about just this. So we're seeing these changes in agricultural practice throughout the tropics, which are being most affected already.
Yeah, Mary said that she was looking at a T.G. Cahir fair scale documentary and looking at the real life consequences of climate change for 3 different communities: India, Pacific Islands, and Kenya, where people have already had to abandon their homes. So it's immediate, and now for them, it's down the road. For us, the severe impacts. But we're how are we doing, Kevin? We're not doing too well. We do like to think of ourselves as a small country, and maybe the big boys should be doing this work and leave us alone. But per head, we are we're very serious contributors, aren't we?
We're not in a good place in terms of emissions per capita. We're among the worst countries in the world, actually. I think we produce the equivalent of about 13,000 tons of CO2 a year per capita, which is, very, very high. And the trouble is that we have set targets for reducing emissions, and they just haven't we haven't achieved them because of a very strong growing economy, very dispersed population, very car dependent society. And then we have very high emissions in agriculture, which account for about 1/3 of our emissions. So notwithstanding the fact that we've committed to more significant action, our delivery has been quite poor. In terms of scale up of renewable energy, which is critical to this conversation, the news is much better there. We're very close to meeting our 2020 targets in terms of adopting renewable energy, particularly wind, and feeding that into the grid, the national grid. And we are global leaders on that, actually, and that's very heartening. And there's a really EirGrid and the government have set a really ambitious target of having 70% renewables on the national grid by 2030. And I think we will achieve that. There's some highlights over the last year that confirm that, and we're getting the technology to do it, but we need massive investment to do that. But I think it's going to happen. I would worry about the emission scenario because there's significant financial penalties if we don't act, and it's a transformation of the economy that's needed. We need to increase active transport. We need to adopt public transport in a much more significant way in our cities and towns. We need to electrify the country, particularly in terms of transport and heat. And we haven't got the momentum to really build on that. I think there's a good chance it will happen, but we need it to happen more promptly. And there is another significant plus for Ireland, and that is offshore wind. We have a distinct advantage in terms of having a stormy sort of interface with the Atlantic with vast amount of wind energy. So there is a plan to scale that up, and it will start with fixed wind farms really in the Irish Sea mainly, and then shift along the south coast and along the west coast. And that brings a very big possibility of us becoming exporters of electricity within the next 20 years, which would be fantastic for the economy and would be fantastic for our emissions.
So essentially, we're causing a lot of emissions through burning fossil fuels, and the idea is that if we can make electricity from wind and other sources, and we switch to using electricity for our transport, our heating, all those things that we used to use, or we use fossil fuels at the moment, then we're on our way to achieving our targets. But wind is the key here. Are we ignoring other possible
solar is big for us
renewables
as well, even though people mightn't realize that solar is very significant. We would have the same solar resources that Germany would have in terms of intensity. So that's a big field for us that's going to expand. Hydro less so, but between solar and wind and battery storage, enhanced battery storage, we could do 95% of our decarbonisation. But it requires a massive amount of investment, and it requires significant policy change. It requires blocking a lot of the difficult processes where we get mainstream or big infrastructure in place. It's very cumbersome in Ireland at present. And, you know, I'm first to say we must be very careful about how we factor in environmental risk, but we seem to be more cumbersome and protracted than our other big economies. So that would stall progress very quickly if we don't address that. And that's why marine planning legislation is being reformed radically as we speak to facilitate the offshore element of it. But I think, you know, I don't think we're going to be embracing nuclear power, even new forms of nuclear power in the next 20 years, because there's no commercial viability on it yet, notwithstanding there are environmental issues as well. So even concentrating on those three things would bring a big return for Ireland and help deliver on those big targets that we have to achieve.
Yeah, so there are opportunities in this area, and we might talk about them in a little while. But just to talk about a little bit more about maybe the pain and what we'll have to do. You're writing during the week that there has to be a change, or we are seeing a change, or in the middle of a change of how government policy will have to take into account climate change seriously, and we can't have one policy going for agricultural expansion and food production, and then another one looking to reduce emissions. So do you think that things are getting serious now?
They are, and it's really to do with what's required in terms of big policy decisions. First is, we have to have a new climate plan ready to submit to Brussels within 2 months. And that must reflect not only just stronger ambition, it must show how we're going to do it. And we've set these targets before, and we haven't been great on the detail, but this one, you have to have the detail. Secondly, within 2 months, we have to, in effect, agree our first carbon budget, a 5-year carbon budget. And that will apply sectoral limits, you know, on transport, agriculture, will have far-reaching implications across the economy, because there's only a certain amount of carbon you're going to be permitted to emit. And then if one sector gets off lightly, it's inevitable then that the punishment will be applied to another. So you can see the frictions already happening within sectors. We're in a difficult position on the agricultural front, and there's a lot of polarization and tension between farmers and environmentalists. And I don't think it helps either side, to be honest with you. But I think it all comes down on that front to the need for a land use plan. And it'd be interesting to see what Liam would think about that. You know, we need to just really work out what we want to use our land for in the future. And, you know, that means nature-based solutions as well. And, you know, we're very lucky in the sense of the amount of peatland that we have. And if we restored, unfortunately, a lot of it is very damaged at the moment, but if we restore a lot of it, it would have a fantastic way of capturing carbon. And I think we'd make an international contribution to storing carbon. But, you know, we're not there yet.
So a new role for farmers and a new income source as well.
Yes, that should be part of the picture.
In terms of managing the environment.
Yeah, Liam, they should be rewarded. Yeah, they should be rewarded for their environmental management. And there should be full acknowledgement of what they do in terms of, you know, managing ecosystems, in terms of managing hedgerows, in terms of forestry. And I don't think that's fully acknowledged at the moment. I think with the reform of CAP, it will come. But I think that will help matters. The other complicating factor is, you know, the European Green Deal has a big element of it in terms of bioenergy, and therefore you're using crops to generate energy. And how do you factor that in as well? That puts a strain on ecosystems as well, and it puts a strain on food production. So it's a very delicate balancing required, and that's why I think a national land use plan quickly agreed with all stakeholders around the table would be the best way forward. And where, you know, we have to be honest about what's required, but also we have to both protect nature and also use nature to bring tangible solutions in this scenario.
Your thoughts, Liam, on that?
So I entirely agree, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge facing us. However, if we get it right, it could set us on the right path. I've been involved tangentially in a number of conservation programs around the world over the years in various roles that I've had. And one of the challenges that you often face is that very often these conservation programs are funded to protect the environment or conserve the environment, but they don't take the human element into account. And if you don't take the human element into account, then you're doomed to failure. So for example, in parts of East Africa, where there's been large mammal programs, not only do they work to conserve the large mammals, but they also invest in providing employment and alternative sources of income for the local people so that they do not lose out economically as a result of this conservation issue, which actually does smack of neo-colonialism when it's applied to the tropics. In Europe too, there is the challenge, and I'm really glad that Kevin mentioned the peatlands, because the peatlands are natural carbon reservoirs. We have them in Ireland. They're still functioning, although most of them have been damaged, but they can serve as future reservoirs. And if we can find a land plan that focuses our productive agriculture in certain areas and then releases other areas for conservation, climate-friendly action, and conservation in general, we may be able to get the best of both worlds. And again, in this, CAP is likely to help the European policy, which will subsidize agriculture. However, we need to also seriously consider other economic drivers. So for example, I live in Austria, and if you go into the Alps, there is a lot of investment there in the natural habitats and the conservation of those natural habitats. And this pays tourist dollars to the economy too. And if we get this balance right, we could stimulate our tourist economy in a way that we haven't done before. So it's not just about seeing old castles and spinning wheels, but it's actually bringing people from around the world, many of whom will come to see Western blanket bog, because you don't have Western blanket bog in Germany, in France, in Holland. You don't have mountain blanket bog in most of these places either. You go from grassland into shrubland and then into scree as you go up a mountain. You don't get a bog effectively forming a carpet over a mountain. We do in Ireland because of our unique set of environmental conditions. And if we have a sensible land use plan, we can factor in not only the conservation issues, the climate change mitigation issues, but also a serious economic boost to our economy if we're brave enough to do it.
And that there are opportunities, but Kevin, it's really important that we've seen already that it's the poorest people in the world will suffer from the effects of climate change, and we have to make sure that the load, the burden is shared equitably. What are you mentioned there that there's opportunities for farmers, because we have a strong social fabric in our countryside here that is based around farming. What are the opportunities moving into the future for, I suppose, for the rural economy and maybe overall for the economy here?
Yeah, I would think the best way to summarize it is that they're custodians of the land, and that should be acknowledged in a tangible way. And with each passing year, that's going to become more important. And what they do will have a direct impact on the ability to reduce carbon, to absorb carbon, to to generate alternative fuels to fossil fuels. So there's loads of possibilities there. And I know this is controversial, but they are very efficient, both in dairying and beef. Now, beef produces a huge amount of carbon, but in comparison to other countries. So I think, if they are determined to improve the carbon efficiency even more and show to the world, I think, Irish farmers can make a huge contribution and help solve the problem. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, I think too many people are in defensive positions and saying, oh, we must expand the national herd, we must feed the world. And so it's a very complex problem. But I think, once farmers, sign up to doing something, they actually deliver on most fronts. And I think people should acknowledge that more. And, when you look at biodiversity projects around the country that have centered around farming, there's some very significant successes. And I've found that farmers are particularly keen to play their part. I think, sometimes farmer bodies don't do them a great favor in that sometimes, because they're obviously trying to defend what they've got and want an expansionist mode to continue for obvious reasons. But the trouble is, the big income that big farmers are getting, that's under threat because of climate change and lack of biodiversity, loss of pollinators. So they all need to step back a little and say, look, we need to coordinate better. But there's no doubt there's opportunities there, and we need to sort of take a longer term view and also to support farmers. I think that's really important in making the transition. Now, the first cohort that where the test will be, are we engaged in just transition, is in the Midlands because of board pneumonia getting out of peat. But the farmers are going to see inevitably, because when you do your carbon maths, you'll see agriculture has to change. So therefore, it's going to be a big turbulent time in a sense for many farmers. So they need to be supported in making that transition. And also, I think very strongly, it has to be done in the context of having a thriving rural economy. Too often, small towns and villages are not thriving because of farming, not going in the right direction, and also a lack of sort of tangible support for rural living. I think you have to address all those moving wheels together to ensure we have a significant impact.
I think I'm reminded of a billboard I saw while sitting in a traffic jam coming out of Belfast in the evening, going onto the M1, and sitting there, and there's a billboard there saying something like, don't curse the traffic, you are the traffic. And I think very often we can point the finger at generation, about industry, food production, all of these things, but that's all for us, the consumer, and it's in all our power to do something, and particularly in terms of our power and our responsibility as consumers, as customers, to change our habits and to consume less, consume more wisely, and and certainly to consume less packaging. Liam, what we've seen during COVID is we've actually seen people pulling together. We've seen society pull together. The vast majority of people try to do the right thing, and for a long time now. Maybe as things dragged on, there's disquiet with some people, and it disproportionately affects different people. But isn't that a positive thing? And doesn't it, if that can be harnessed for climate change as we emerge from COVID, but with giving people proper direction and proper targets, and to see that there's an equitable approach, that other people that it's evenly spread, doesn't that bode well for the future?
Yeah, I'd say it does bode well. In fact, I was very impressed at how, various societies around the world pulled together on this. And I wasn't too disheartened at the dissenters, because there should always be a dissenting voice, but we need to be able to discuss our disagreements and then move forward. And I think the unity, if I want to use, for want of a better word, that most societies dealt with COVID is exemplary. And it might be that this sense of responsibility for not only oneself, but one's neighbors and one's planet may continue into the future. And this could be in many different ways. It could be, as you say, in the way we consume. It could be that we may consider consuming less, but also it could be from looking at biodiversity and being aware of biodiversity in our own individual lives. So, there'll be many people who will have, bird watching or field botany as a hobby. And if we can spread that hobby and open people's eyes to not only the beauty of nature, but also the role of nature in our urban environments, in our Irish rural environments, I think we will become we will have a deeper appreciation of the role of nature and our place in it. Now, I'm not saying that watching kingfishers at the Royal Canal is going to change global climate policy. However, if people begin to consider how looking at that kingfisher in the Royal Canal fits into the Earth system, then I think it will begin to inform how we make decisions on a daily basis. And it's a bit like, monks saying the Psalms every day. If we pay attention to biodiversity every day, even in a small way, it becomes part of us, and it becomes part of our, if you want, for our ethical makeup, and it'll help guide our decisions. And on another level too, the engagement of individuals in nature like this is also a source of huge amounts of data for scientists like me. So there are many citizen science projects around the world. Many of them are involved in identifying new solar systems or planets way off the surface of this planet. But many of them are also being set up to begin to investigate biodiversity and to get people to log their information for bigger projects. And this data will all be useful. So as Kevin says, if there's a national land use plan, wouldn't it be great to have alongside that a citizen science biodiversity plan, which builds on the biodiversity framework and data that the state has already acquired, but then can be added to, and then we can monitor the impact of the new policy over the next 20, 30 years, and use those data to then make decisions about what the next steps, like what will the land use policy version 2 look like. So I think that the biodiversity and being aware of biodiversity has ways of linking into our lives in many different ways, from the almost spiritual all the way to hard raw data that scientists use to implement policy.
I could come in there.
Liam, you'll be glad to hear. Sorry, we'll come back to you just in a second, Kevin, because this is a good time to inform you that we are surrounded by people who are aware of biodiversity, and we have some of those with some of our pictures now. I'm just going to show these pictures and we'll come back to Kevin and Liam. And if anyone has any questions of that, pop them in the chat. And I'm just going to show you some of our pictures now. This is from Caroline Kavanagh up in County Louth and on the coast, looking at the lovely plants. Is that sea pink there, Liam?
Yeah, and Beta maritima, right? So that's the plant.
You took the words out of my mouth there. Okay, and then let's look at that was from Caroline. Thank you, Caroline. And now we have a picture of this is the River Suck, and this is from Colette Gill, and she took that today. And I would like to wish my mother-in-law a very happy 94th birthday. Colette has gone down to see her for that, and she took time to send us some pictures. Our competition was for people to show biodiversity on your doorstep, and here's one of also from Colette of and this is, you know, showing how plant and life is so resilient, growing in cracks in walls. Next we have Deirdre Boyle, who has sent a picture of rhododendrons at Holt Castle. So lovely. If you're around Dublin, it's a great place to go this time of the year, see the spectacular rhododendrons and get a fantastic view of Dublin Bay and North Dublin. Now, these are from Paul Gibbons, and this is a geranium flower, beautiful. And we heard yesterday, geraniums very good for our pollinators. Now, in keeping with the biodiversity on our doorstep team, Paul photographed this from just outside his house, a heron, and then a nice shot of the heron flying away. And it's amazing to watch the herons with their big wings beating so slowly. It's almost incredible how they do manage to take off. So thank you. And Paul sent another one here of his garden. And this is a good shot because it shows trees like this with all the cracks and fissures in their barks and ivy on it is great, a great home for insects. And then, of course, in turn, there's loads of birds will come for those insects. So thank you, Paul, for all of those. And Paul, we liked your series of pictures showing biodiversity on our doorstep. So we're going to send you a biodiversity guidebook. And now, but the picture that wins the ticket for 2 to Lafcadia Hearn Japanese Gardens in Tramore is this one from Peter Hennessy, who has been with us all week as well. And this is a woodpecker coming to his peanut feeder. And Peter is in Carlow. And we heard just last Saturday, or was it Sunday, that the woodpeckers are colonizing the country. And I've yet to see one. I have heard one, but I have yet to see one, and I'm looking forward to that. So thank you for all your pictures. And that's just show that the people involved in the Bealtaine Living Earth Festival, you know, are aware of nature, and people come to it from different points. It could be a spiritual, it could be health, it could be a recognition of the economic importance, say, of pollinators and things like that. There's lots and lots of different reasons, but we certainly are richer in our lives for biodiversity and being aware of biodiversity. I interrupted you there, Kevin. You were going to come in on that.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, but anyway. No, I wanted to just reinforce what Liam has said, because that was a really powerful message about biodiversity, not just observing biodiversity, but contributing to its preservation and enhancement, and also through citizen science, which is a really powerful way of contributing to protection of these ecosystems. And I know the festival has been fantastic in promoting that. But what I would like to sort of underpin that with is the good news, in the sense that I think people are much more determined now to make a contribution, and they want to play a part in addressing the climate crisis. They're increasingly recognizing that, you know, tough decisions have to be taken and we must get to a better place. And I think that's really fantastic. And you know, we need to harness that. And you know, and to go back to your point about consumers being so important, companies are now beginning to see that that's what, you know, they want. That's what their consumers or customers are saying to them. You know, what are you doing to embrace sustainability. How can I recognize that? Is it tangible? You know, how do you account for your carbon footprint? How do you reduce your emissions in your supply chains? But that's a great dynamic. But I think we are plagued, and I'm not criticizing any particular political party, but we have short-termism in our political system because of short electoral cycles. So politicians are very reluctant to move, you know, and longer-term crises don't really get the consideration that they should. Like we're very exercised, and rightly so, about the housing crisis at the moment, but the climate crisis is 1,000 times worse, and it's coming down the tracks. So I think just to suggest that, unfortunately, because of COVID, climate activism, in my view, was blunted a little, because it was building great momentum through young campaigners, and you know, they were physically out on the streets and all that. And I think, you know, not suggesting, telling them what to do, but they need to raise their voice again, because you need to get those politicians feeling uneasy and knowing they must act. And I think that, you know, that momentum needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah, I think one of the great things, though, is the awareness of our young people. They are fully aware of climate change and what needs to be done. And that gives me a good opportunity to share with you a message from St. Mary's, the girls in St. Mary's, the TYs in St. Mary's in New Ross, who sent us this message. So this is their plan for their school in biodiversity. We have 410 transition year students over the last 6 weeks doing a project on sustainability. And part of the output of that is that they're producing these TikTok videos and YouTube videos, and they're going to be sent to primary schools and to communicate with their messages for their own age group. So that's a wonderful project that we have going in at the moment. It's just finishing up. So thanks to all the teachers who have been involved in that, and thanks to all the young people. So I'm just going to, if you have time, please, we're going over our normal time, but I just wanted to share something with Liam for a few minutes, and then we'll have some parting messages. And if people have any comments, to please put them in the chat. So Liam, maybe you might tell people, you did talk about citizen science and people getting involved in biodiversity. Maybe you might tell people how they could go about it, or how you got interested in biodiversity at first, and where that might have happened.
Well, I grew up in...
You recognize that?
I do recognize that, but it didn't look like that back when I was a kid. So I grew up next to the Royal Canal in Dublin, and in a house that was on a housing estate between the Royal Canal and the Phoenix Park. And as a youngster, I'd spend a lot of time down in these various areas. And then I began to notice some unusual birds. So for example, I mentioned kingfishers earlier, and I couldn't believe that I'd see something as beautiful as a kingfisher down in the Royal Canal, because up until then, I'd only seen exotic looking birds on documentaries on television. And then, you know, the penny dropped. It's all around you. And so no matter where you live, you can find biodiversity, and you can explore biodiversity. And looking for it and observing it, you will begin to appreciate the complexity of the ecosystems in which we live. And you will begin to ponder the dependence of, for example, the kingfisher on the fish that are in the canal, that depend on the plants that are growing in the canal. And you'll begin to work out for yourself how everything is interconnected, and how the feedbacks that we discussed earlier are involved. And I've been quite lucky, because having started down at the Royal Canal as a youngster, then I've spent my career continuing to work in asking questions about the role of organisms, and in my case, plants in particular, in the Earth system. So for me, as a geneticist studying how plants grow and develop, and how they evolved from green, slimy things that grew in the water, and then 470 million years ago appeared on land, and within 100 million years had formed 50-meter tall trees. That journey for me started right here where Owen is showing here is the Royal Canal. And so it shows that for me, for example, that your window into biodiversity is right on your doorstep. It's not somewhere away. It's on the other side of the world. It's on your doorstep. And understanding how these chains of interaction feed into a healthy environment, and that allows humans to exist. So, for example, there's joggers there. How we as humans can exist and extract good, and what the horrible term is called ecosystem services, the services that the environment gives to us. You will get a much deeper appreciation of those. So it's interesting to see how the Royal Canal has changed over the years.
Thank you, Liam. It's about getting out and valuing what's on your doorstep. If we value what's on our doorstep, we can value the rest of the world. Kevin, what would your closing remarks be about the challenges ahead and what we as individuals should be doing?
I think the one key thing is to avoid despondency, really, and to channel our energies into doing something. And we can all do something, and we can do it in our own local area, and we can do it collectively. And I think if we sort of are determined to do something on both the climate issue and the biodiversity issue, and as Liam was saying earlier, they're really intertwined, that that we can get an outcome, a good outcome, and it will be better for society. It will be better for our own sustainable future in terms of living on this planet, and we will have better jobs, we will have more pleasant surroundings, and we will engage with nature more. So it's not to be overwhelmed by the negativity that's out there, by the science that can be really overwhelming sometimes, and to try and channel the energy into doing something, into making a contribution. And it can be quite small, but it adds up to something significant very quickly, I can assure you.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to finish on. As we emerge out of COVID, it does give us great opportunities to review how we do things, to reflect on, it doesn't have to be like it is. We can change things, and as we emerge from COVID, we can change how we work in our jobs, how we can look at as we restart the economy. We can look at prioritizing green the green responses, and we can look at urgently set to try and meet our targets, because every day counts. And I'm delighted that we were able to address this issue on the last day of our festival. We had a great festival looking at different aspects of biodiversity and our natural world. And now the International Day for Biodiversity theme is about what I can do for nature. And I'm glad that we could look at not only what we can do, but what we must do. So I'd like to thank Kevin and Liam for giving us their time on a Sunday in particular, double time on a Sunday. And I'd like to thank Ben, who has been at the controls all week, and who had to step in once or twice when I pressed the wrong buttons. I'd like to thank Sheila for helping with the festival, Kaylee for doing the coordination of it. I'd like to thank Una as well for her contributions, and Enrica as well. I'd like to thank Waterford Institute of Technology and all our speakers, and I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us. And it's been very pleasurable to do this every evening. I won't pretend that it's that easy to do it, but it's been very pleasurable to be with you all. And I hope and I'm confident that this time next year we'll be able to meet in person. We will keep an online presence to be able to reach people all around Ireland and all around the world, but we hope to see you face to face out in nature, up close, with all the smells and sounds and the beautiful sights. So thank you all, and look after yourselves, and until we see you again, good evening.